The invitation had been her idea, a festive gathering at the upscale Sienna Ridge Country Club to celebrate the holidays with friends and colleagues. Julia's enthusiasm had been contagious as she detailed the decorations, the catered menu, and the chance to mingle with everyone who mattered. She knew I wasn't fond of crowded events or shallow small talk, but her radiant smile and that emerald dress made it impossible to refuse. I agreed, more for her happiness than my own. The evening started predictably. I found solace in a quiet corner, nursing a scotch and nodding politely during conversations with acquaintances I barely knew. Julia, on the other hand, glided through the crowd like a seasoned diplomat, captivating everyone with her charm. I watched her closely, not out of jealousy but pride. She had a way of lighting up a room, and tonight was no exception. But something shifted as the night wore on. At first, it was subtle, her laugh a little too loud, her touches on others lingering a bit too long. I dismissed it as the effects of champagne and her natural charisma. It wasn't until I noticed her absence, her once familiar presence suddenly gone from the room, that unease began to creep in. I scanned the hall, my eyes darting over clusters of partygoers, but she was nowhere in sight. When I finally found her, it felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath me. There she was, tucked into a shadowed alcove near the dance floor, her back to me, leaning into a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and sharply dressed, his posture exuding confidence. His hand rested on her lower back, a touch too intimate for strangers, far too familiar for friends. My breath caught as I watched her laugh at something he said, her head tilting back in a way that made my stomach churn. I approached without fully forming a plan, my feet moving of their own accord. "Julia," I said, my voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd and the low hum of jazz in the background. She turned, her expression a blend of surprise and something I couldn't quite place. Annoyance? Guilt? No. Neither. It was indifference. "Oh, hey," she said, her tone light as if I'd interrupted a casual chat. "Lucas, this is Mark. He's from the firm, one of the partners." She gestured toward him, the man extending a hand with a smirk that made my fists clench. I didn't take it. "We were just talking about a project," she continued, brushing her hair over her shoulder. The gesture felt rehearsed, calculated. "You don't mind, do you?" I stared at her, struggling to process the scene before me. "What kind of project involves his hand on your back?" I asked, my voice low but edged with steel. Her eyes narrowed, the first crack in her polished demeanor. "Don't do this here," she hissed, her smile faltering as she glanced around at the curious faces now watching us. "You're making a scene." "Making a scene?" I repeated, my disbelief palpable. "You're the one cozying up to your boss in the middle of the room, and I'm the problem?" Mark's smirk widened, his audacity stunning. "Relax, man," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "It's just a little harmless fun. Nothing to get worked up about." The nonchalance in his voice ignited something primal in me. Before I knew it, I closed the distance between us, my fist colliding with his jaw in a burst of motion. He staggered back, crashing into the table behind him, sending glasses and plates clattering to the floor. Gasps filled the room, the music halting abruptly as all eyes turned toward the commotion. Julia's sharp gasp barely registered over the pounding in my ears. "Lucas, stop it," she shouted, her voice high with a mix of anger and disbelief. She rushed to Mark's side, helping him to his feet, her hand lingering on his arm. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of fury coursing through me. "You've got some nerve," I said, my voice trembling with restrained rage as I pointed at him. "And you," I turned to Julia, "I trusted you." She flinched, her eyes darting away before narrowing into a glare. "Don't you dare try to make this my fault," she snapped. "You overreacted. You always overreact." I opened my mouth to retort, but the words caught in my throat. Her deflection, her lack of remorse, was like a slap to the face. I stared at her, searching for any sign of the woman I thought I knew, but she was a stranger now. Mark, still nursing his bruised jaw, chuckled darkly. You should learn to control your temper, Lucas, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. No wonder she looks elsewhere for some entertainment. The words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, all I saw was red. I lunged toward him again, but strong hands gripped my arms, pulling me back. That's enough, a voice said firmly, dragging me away from the scene. As I was hauled toward the exit, I caught one last glimpse of Julia. She stood there, her arms crossed, her expression one of irritation rather than concern. She didn't follow, didn't call out, didn't even meet my eyes. It was as if I no longer existed to her. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stumbled outside, the door slamming shut behind me. I stood there for a moment, my breath visible in the icy air, my heart pounding in my chest. Rage and heartbreak swirled together, threatening to consume me. She had betrayed me, not just with her actions, but with her apathy. And that hurt more than anything else. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at nothing, before the door opened again. Julia stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached me. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusatory. I turned to her, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "What's wrong with me?" "You're asking me that?" Her arms crossed over her chest. "You embarrassed me in there. Do you have any idea how ridiculous you looked?" I laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Ridiculous? You let him put his hands on you. You smiled at him like he was the only one in the room. And I'm the one who embarrassed you?" She rolled her eyes, her exasperation infuriatingly casual. "It was nothing, Lucas. You're blowing this out of proportion." Her words were the final nail in the coffin. I stared at her, my chest tightening as the realization hit me like a freight train. She didn't care. Not about me, not about us, not about what we had built together. "You think this is overreacting?" I said, my voice cold. "Fine. Watch how I react now." Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the cold. She didn't call after me, didn't try to stop me. And as much as it hurt, I knew then that she never would. The car ride home was a blur, the silence in the vehicle almost deafening. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, the image of her indifference playing on a loop in my mind. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my heart was pounding, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing pain that made it hard to breathe. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dimly lit house, a symbol of everything we had built together /U 2014 or so I thought. She arrived minutes later, parking her car without a glance in my direction. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she approached the door, her posture defiant. When she turned to look at me, the street lamp illuminated her face. There was no remorse, no regret /U 2014, just irritation. "Are you coming inside, or are you planning to sulk out here all night?" she asked, her tone sharp and dismissive. I exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to respond. Instead, I followed her into the house. The door closed with a resounding finality, and the tension between us was palpable. She tossed her bag on the counter and kicked off her heels, her actions casual, as though nothing significant had happened. "You need to get over this," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "It was one dance, Lucas. One. You made it into a spectacle." I stared at her, my disbelief bubbling over. "You think this is about the dance?" My voice was steady, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "This is about respect, Julia. Or the complete lack of it." Her eyes rolled, and she crossed her arms. "You're acting like a child." That was it. The dam broke. "You humiliated me," I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. "In front of everyone. You let him touch you like that, let him talk to me like I was nothing, and now you have the audacity to act like I'm the one who's overreacting." Her expression hardened, the calm facade she wore cracking slightly. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she snapped, her tone venomous. I took a step closer, lowering my voice but keeping it firm. "Yes, you do. Because I deserve that much, at the very least." But she didn't answer. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked upstairs, her dismissal loud and clear. The sound of her bedroom door slamming shut was the final blow. I stood there in the quiet aftermath, my chest heaving as I stared at the spot where she had stood moments ago. Something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, sharp and consuming, but beneath it, a steely resolve began to take root. If she didn't care about this marriage, then why should I? The next morning, I called in sick to work. It wasn't difficult to feign the exhaustion that had settled deep into my bones. Julia had already left for the day, no doubt off to her job at the marketing firm where she thrived as the center of attention. With the house to myself, I began to formulate a plan. The first step was practical. I accessed our shared accounts and methodically transferred half the money into a separate account in my name. It was a fair division /U 2014 legal, even /U 2014, but it was also a safeguard. If this was how things were going to go, I needed to be prepared. Next, I sifted through the digital trail she hadn't bothered to hide. Emails, text messages, receipts /U 2014, it was all there, a breadcrumb trail of betrayal. What I found made my stomach churn: late-night messages, unexplained charges at upscale restaurants, even hotel stays under her name. And it wasn't just Mark. There were others. Every revelation was a dagger to the heart, but it also fueled my determination. She had chosen to play this game, and now she would face the consequences. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed. Screenshots, receipts, a timeline of her indiscretions. It wasn't just evidence, it was an unflinching record of her disregard for the life we had built together. And I wasn't going to let her walk away from it unscathed. The weekend brought a perfect opportunity. Julia had planned a dinner party at our house, a small gathering of friends and colleagues. It was the kind of event she thrived on, showcasing her charm and the seemingly perfect life she had curated. I decided it would also be the stage for her undoing. The night arrived, and I played my role to perfection. Smiling, chatting, offering drinks to our guests as if everything was fine. Julia, in her element, floated from conversation to conversation, her laughter ringing out like a bell. She wore a deep blue dress that turned heads, her confidence radiating. But as the night progressed, her mask began to slip. She caught me staring at her once or twice, and though I smiled, there was something in my eyes that made her pause. She didn't know what was coming, and that made it all the more satisfying. When dessert was served, I stood, raising my glass for a toast. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward me. Julia beamed, expecting me to say something charming, something that would reflect well on her. Before we dig in, I began, my voice warm and steady. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. It's been a challenging week, but having you all here means a lot. Julia's smile faltered slightly, sensing the undertone in my words. I turned to her, holding her gaze. And I want to thank my wife, Julia, for reminding me of the importance of honesty in a relationship. The air shifted, a murmur rippling through the guests. Julia's eyes widened, her cheeks flushing as she realized where this was going. Because honesty, I continued, my voice hardening, is the foundation of trust. And without it, nothing else matters. I pulled out my phone, tapping the screen. The television on the wall flickered to life, displaying a series of messages, photos, and receipts. Gasps filled the room as the evidence of her betrayals played out in vivid detail. Julia shot to her feet, her voice a low hiss. "What the hell are you doing?" "Showing everyone the truth," I replied, my tone cold and unyielding. "Since you seem to have no interest in doing it yourself." The room erupted into chaos, the guests whispering and staring in disbelief. Julia's facade crumbled, her anger and panic spilling over. But her words, her protests, meant nothing now. I didn't stay to watch her unravel completely. Grabbing my coat, I turned and walked out the door, leaving her to face the wreckage she had created. The door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the muffled chaos inside. The cool night air hit me like a bomb, soothing the fire raging in my chest. I stood on the front porch for a moment, taking in deep breaths, my hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. It was over. The years of lies, the facade of a perfect marriage, the blind trust I'd clung to, it was all gone. And in its place was a hollow, aching void I couldn't yet comprehend. But there was no going back. Julia had made her choices, and I had made mine. The next morning, I wasted no time. Divorce papers were filed before noon, the cold, clinical process of it almost surreal. I listed irreconcilable differences, though the truth was far messier. My lawyer assured me I had the upper hand. With the evidence I'd gathered, Julia would have no room to dispute the terms. It was a small consolation, but it felt like a step toward reclaiming my life. By the end of the week, I had moved out of the house. I took only what was mine, the clothes, personal items, a few keepsakes that actually meant something to me. The rest I left behind. I didn't want the furniture we'd picked out together, the photos from trips that now felt like lies, or the reminders of a life that no longer existed. I found a small apartment downtown, modest but enough for one person. The emptiness of it was both liberating and suffocating. For the first time in years, I was alone. Truly alone. And while part of me relished the silence, another part of me was haunted by the echoes of everything I had lost. The fallout for Julia was swift and unforgiving. Word of the dinner party spread quickly, the scandal becoming the talk of her social circle. Friends who once fawned over her began to distance themselves, their polite smiles replaced by awkward glances and whispered conversations. At work, rumors swirled, her polished reputation tarnished by the revelations. I didn't revel in her downfall, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't bring a sense of justice. She had built her life on lies, manipulating those around her, and now the facade was crumbling. She was left to pick up the pieces, alone and exposed. But the pain didn't vanish overnight. Anger lingered, its sharp edges cutting into me at unexpected moments. Memories of happier times resurfaced like cruel reminders of what could have been. I spent sleepless nights replaying every conversation, every red flag I'd ignored, trying to make sense of how we had ended up here. The anger gave way to grief, and the grief to something quieter, more reflective. I began to see the cracks that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. Julia's charm, her need for attention, the subtle ways she had always controlled the narrative, it all painted a picture I hadn't wanted to see. Loving her had blinded me to the truth, and letting go of that love was the hardest part. Months passed, and with them came a slow but steady healing. I threw myself into work, rediscovered old hobbies, and began to rebuild a life that was mine and mine alone. The apartment, once cold and empty, started to feel like home. I painted the walls, added plants, and filled the shelves with books I had always meant to read. It was a quiet life, but it was honest, and that was enough. Then one day, out of the blue, Julia called. I stared at the phone as her name lit up the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity and a lingering sense of unfinished business compelled me to answer. "Lucas," she began, her voice tentative, almost meek. It was a tone I hadn't heard from her in years. "What do you want, Julia?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a pause, the sound of her breath hitching. I wanted to talk. To explain. I let out a bitter laugh. Explain? It's a little late for that, don't you think? I know, she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything. But I need you to understand, it wasn't about you. It was about me. My insecurities, my need to feel validated. I made mistakes, terrible ones, and I regret them every single day. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old connection, the bond we once shared. But it was fleeting, drowned out by the memory of her betrayal. I'm not sure what you want me to say, I replied, my voice calm but firm. You made your choices, Julia. And I've made mine. I need you to forgive me, she said, her voice breaking. Not for me, but for you. So you can move on. I closed my eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Forgiveness. It wasn't something I had considered, but maybe it was the final step I needed to take. I'll think about it, I said finally, my tone softer. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. I understand, she said quietly. Thank you, Lucas. For everything. The call ended, and I sat there in silence, the phone still clutched in my hand. I didn't feel anger or sadness, just a quiet sense of closure. Julia had been a part of my life, a chapter filled with love and heartbreak, but that chapter was over. It was time to turn the page. As I looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was ready to face it on my own terms. And that was enough. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, the pieces of my life began to fit together in new and unexpected ways. The weight I had carried for so long, the resentment, the anger, the regret, began to lift. It wasn't an overnight transformation, it came in small, quiet moments. Like the first time I laughed at a stupid joke a coworker told, or when I spent an entire Saturday painting my apartment and felt a strange sense of accomplishment. Each moment was a reminder that life didn't stop because Julia had betrayed me. One evening, as I was tidying up my apartment, a knock at the door interrupted the calm. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I was greeted by a familiar face, Daniel, an old friend I hadn't seen in years. He was someone I had grown apart from during my marriage, as Julia had slowly pushed away people who didn't fit into her curated image of our lives. Daniel, I said, surprised. What are you doing here? He smiled, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. I heard about everything. I figured you might need a friend. His words caught me off guard. For so long, I had convinced myself that no one cared, that I was alone in the fallout of Julia's betrayal. But here he was, standing in front of me, extending an olive branch. Come in, I said, stepping aside. We spent hours catching up, talking about everything from work to old memories. He didn't press me for details about Julia, though I could tell he wanted to. When I finally did open up, sharing the raw, unfiltered truth of what had happened, he listened without judgment. Man, you've been through the ringer, he said, shaking his head. But you're still standing. That says a lot. His words stuck with me long after he left. They reminded me that I wasn't defined by what had happened. I was still me, scarred, but stronger for it. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding not just my life, but my sense of self. I started going to the gym again, something I had abandoned during my marriage. I joined a book club, rediscovering my love for reading. I even signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never found the time for. Each new activity was a step forward, a way to reclaim the parts of myself I had lost. Then one day, as I was walking through a park with my camera, I saw her. Julia. She was sitting on a bench, her posture stiff, her gaze distant. She looked different, thinner, paler, as if the weight of everything had taken a toll on her. For a moment, I considered walking the other way, avoiding her entirely. But something in me urged me to approach. Julia, I said, my voice tentative. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. Lucas. We stood there for a moment, the silence heavy between us. Finally, she gestured to the bench. Do you want to sit? I hesitated, then nodded. Sitting next to her felt strange, like stepping back into a life I had left behind. She fiddled with the hem of her coat, avoiding my gaze. How have you been? She asked, her voice soft. Better, I said honestly. How about you? She let out a humorless laugh. Not great. I guess you heard about everything. I nodded. There was no point in pretending otherwise. Her career had suffered, her social circle had all but disappeared, and she was now living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. The life she had built on lies had crumbled, leaving her with little to hold on to. I deserved it, she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. I hurt you. I hurt myself. I don't know why I did it. Her admission caught me off guard. For so long, I had waited for an apology, some acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. And now, hearing it, I didn't know how to feel. I hated you for a long time, I admitted. I hated what you did, how little you seemed to care. But I've realized that holding on to that hate wasn't helping me. It was just keeping me stuck. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry, Lucas. For everything. You didn't deserve any of it. I took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. I forgive you, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean I want to go back. I understand, she said, her voice trembling. I don't expect anything from you. I wanted you to know. We sat there for a while longer, the weight of our shared past lingering in the air. When we finally parted ways, I felt lighter, as if a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. As I walked away, the sun setting behind me, I felt a quiet sense of closure. Julia had been a chapter in my life, painful, messy, but ultimately transformative. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was excited to find out. And that was enough.